In April 2024, OpenAI fired one of its smartest young minds. The official reason was a leak, but the reason he says they really fired him is far darker. Weeks later, he published 165 pages that moved $1 trillion, comparing himself to the men who built the atomic bomb, and laying out the AI boom you're living through right now with names and dates. It spread through Washington like a classified file. Even Ivanka Trump told her followers to read it. But the real question isn't whether he was right. It's what he saw inside OpenAI that made him believe the next decade might have already been decided.
Feel it, right? I mean, I think 2023 was the sort of moment for me where it went from kind of AGI as a sort of theoretical abstract thing, and you'd make the models to like, I see it, I feel it, and like, I see the path, I see where it's going.
Long before the world had any reason to listen, he says he already knew. Not from a spreadsheet, from a single moment he can date exactly. Here's how he described it. His name is Leopold Aschenbrenner, and long before he was this certain, he was a problem. He graduated from Columbia at 19, valedictorian. The people who would later work with him used a different word for him, scarily smart. Before that, he had worked at Sam Bankman-Fried's Future Fund and resigned just months before it collapsed into one of the largest frauds in history. It was a pattern that would repeat. He had a way of landing inside powerful institutions right as they began to crack. By 22, he was inside OpenAI, on the one team built to keep a future superintelligence from slipping out of human control. It was called Super Alignment. In April of 2024, they fired him. The official line was a leak, a document he had shared with 3 outside researchers for feedback. But the reason he says they really fired him is far more troubling. According to Aschenbrenner, he had sent the board a memo flagging that OpenAI's security was so thin that Chinese state actors could walk straight out the door with the most powerful technology humanity had ever built. And he wasn't speaking in the abstract.
There's like an indictment of a guy who just like stole the code, a bunch of like really important AI code, and went to China with it. And all he had to do to steal the code was copy the code and put it into Apple Notes and then export it as PDF. And that got past their monitoring, right? And Google has the best security of any of them.
That was one engineer at Google, not even OpenAI, and only today's secrets. What kept Aschenbrenner up at night was tomorrow's prize, the superintelligence itself. He was sure China would come for it, but 2 years later, they did something no one predicted, least of all him. As for the memo, OpenAI says it had nothing to do with why he left. But by his account, the man hired to worry about catastrophic risk had just been let go for raising one, so he did the only thing he had left. He published the warning himself. He called it Situational Awareness, and he dedicated it to the man who had led that team, Ilya Sutskever. It opened with a line that was either visionary or insufferable, depending on who you asked. You can see the future first in San Francisco. A few hundred people, he wrote, already understood what was coming. The rest of the world simply hadn't woken up. And what he saw was not what everyone else was looking at. In 2024, the race to build AI looked like a contest of software, better models, smarter chatbots, more elegant code. Aschenbrenner said the whole industry had it backwards. On the podcast that made him famous, he put it flatly.
Unlike basically most things that have come out of Silicon Valley recently, AI is kind of this industrial process. The next model doesn't just require, some code. It's building a giant new cluster. Now it's building giant new power plants. Pretty soon it's going to be building giant new fabs.
Not software, steel and electricity. His whole case was a staircase. Every couple of years, the leading model trains on roughly 10 times more computing power than the last, and each step needs 10 times the electricity to feed it. In 2022, a top cluster drew about 10 megawatts, enough for 10,000 homes. By 2024, 100 megawatts. For 2026, he projected a full gigawatt, the output of a large nuclear reactor, funneled into one building of chips. Then 10 gigawatts, a small American state. And by 2030, 100 gigawatts, a single cluster pulling more than a fifth of all the electricity the United States generates, 10,000 times the first one. And that led him somewhere unexpected. The thing that would decide who won wasn't money, and it wasn't even chips. It was power. Power has become the binding constraint, he wrote. The favorite question in Silicon Valley had quietly shrunk to 4 words. Where do I find 10 gigawatts? And he didn't stop at the demand. He named where the gas would come from. The Marcellus Shale, West Texas, and the 1,200 wells the biggest cluster would take. A 22-year-old was writing national energy policy. In 2024, all of it sounded like science fiction. American electricity output had grown barely 5% in a decade. Asking the grid to swell by a fifth was, on its face, ridiculous. And then, one by one, the numbers started coming in. Here is the part that should unsettle you. Almost every step on that staircase happened, and faster than he drew it. His chart didn't reach a single gigawatt until 2026. It came early, in the first weeks of the year, on the edge of Memphis. One machine crossed into gigawatt scale, the first on Earth. It didn't stop there. The 10 gigawatt cluster he'd placed in 2028, the one nobody believed, was taking shape years ahead of schedule, and it had a name. Stargate. $500 billion committed to build exactly what he had described. And Stargate was just one project this year. The biggest tech companies are on track to spend over $600 billion between them. All of it has to go somewhere, and it's going to the chips. The company that makes them, NVIDIA, is now the most valuable company in the world. $4 trillion, then 5. Point by point, his chart was turning into the headlines. But the money and the chips were never the real story. It hid in the quietest claim in the essay. The real ceiling on AI, he had written, wouldn't be silicon, it would be electricity. And he was right. These data centers draw so much power, they started competing with everyone else, with homes. The largest grid in America hit a shortfall it had never seen. Transformers, back-ordered for years. And the cost of all that hunger surfaced somewhere very ordinary. The question that began in San Francisco, where do I find 10 gigawatts, became a line on the power bills of the 65 million people that grid serves, climbing by double digits in the hardest hit zones. He hadn't forecast the boom. He had drawn its blueprint, down to the year, which is what makes the next part so strange. Because his boldest call, the one everyone quoted, is the one reality keeps contradicting. The line everyone quoted was about the government. Aschenbrenner looked at the trillion-dollar clusters and the contest with China, a technology he believed could decide the century, closer to a weapon than a product, and reached what felt to him like the only possible conclusion. No private startup should be trusted to hold a weapon like that alone. He said it without flinching. He even gave it a date. By 2027 or 2028, he wrote, Washington would finally wake up, and when it did, it would move fast. The leading labs merged, voluntarily, into one national effort, a Manhattan Project for AI, with Congress signing checks in the trillions. He framed it as inevitability, a schedule, not a guess. So far, none of it has happened. If anything, the country has spent 2 years drifting the other way. There is no national project. There is no merger. Congress never wrote the checks. Superintelligence is still being built exactly where he said it never could be, inside a handful of private companies. 5 of them, competing with each other, with no one in command. The man who swore the government would seize the future watched it do nothing at all. But the vanished project was only half of it. The other half was unfolding across the Pacific, in China. All along, the thing he feared most had a name. China. He had written that they would come for it the way a spy comes for a secret, breaking into the labs, copying the weights, walking out with the crown jewels of American AI. And 2 years on, China came for it. Just not the way he wrote. A company called DeepSeek released a model that matched the best America had built. What stunned people wasn't that it was good, it was the price. They'd done it for a fraction of the cost. By their own account, a tiny sliver of what the American labs were spending. Remember his whole argument that the future would belong to whoever could pour the most compute, the most electricity, the most money into the biggest cluster. DeepSeek did the opposite. They didn't outspend anyone. They were simply radically more efficient. The man who said scale would decide everything had just been answered by a team that barely scaled at all. China didn't beat his thesis. It turned it inside out. But what he dreaded was cruder than clever engineering. It was outright theft. And in 2024, he had laid it out himself.
Different things, right? So one threat model is just stealing the weights themselves, and the weights one is sort of particularly insane, right? Because they can just like steal the literal like end product, right? Just like make a replica of the atomic bomb, and then they're just like ready to go. And I think that.
And something like it did arrive, though not the way he had pictured. OpenAI told Congress that DeepSeek had been distilling its models. Anthropic went further, Chinese labs, DeepSeek among them, running 16 million queries through 24,000 fake accounts to copy American systems. DeepSeek denied all of it. He had called the threat years early. He had just guarded the wrong entrance, watching the vault, while they walked in through the open door of the public API. He'd even asked whether America would really build a superintelligence inside a Gulf state. By 2026, the answer was going up in the Abu Dhabi desert, $30 billion. So on China, he wasn't a forecaster who failed. He was right about the danger and wrong about the shape it would take. Exactly half right. But the real contradiction was only beginning, because by now, Aschenbrenner had stopped writing about the future. He had started betting on it. In the fall of 2024, he launched a fund. He called it, of course, Situational Awareness. It started with a few $100 million. Within a year, it was running over $5 billion, and by this summer, north of 20. It was backed by some of the biggest names in tech, the Collison brothers, Daniel Gross, Nat Friedman, and Aschenbrenner had poured almost his entire personal fortune into it. But look at what he actually bought. Not the AI labs, not the model builders everyone else was chasing. He bet on the layer underneath. Power plants, fuel cells, the unglamorous companies that keep the electrons moving. For a stretch, his single biggest holding was a fuel cell maker. His portfolio was his essay, rewritten as money, iron, electricity, silicon, the physical spine of the build-out. Long, almost all of it. The AI labs everyone else was chasing, barely $1. He had written that the physical world would decide this race, and he staked his fortune exactly there. Which raises an uncomfortable question. The man who begged the state to take this technology out of private hands is now quietly growing rich on those same private hands. Conviction? Or just talking his own book? Months earlier, he let the logic slip himself.
Why is AGI not priced in? It's sort of, why hasn't the government nationalized the labs yet, right? It's like, this, society hasn't priced it in yet, and sort of it hasn't completely diffused. And, again, it might be wrong, right? But I just think sort of.
It might be wrong. That was Leopold Aschenbrenner's own warning about his predictions. And 2 years later, here's the verdict. He got almost exactly half of it right. The physical world he described is, almost line for line, what happened. The giant clusters, the gigawatts, power plants built just to feed the chips, the grid straining, electricity bills climbing. He didn't just predict the AI boom, he drew its blueprint, down to the year. That half of the future really was already decided. But the moment his predictions left the world of steel and electricity, they fell apart. He was certain the US government would take control of AI. It hasn't. It's still a handful of private companies, building it themselves, with no one in charge. He was certain China would steal it. They didn't. They built their own version for a fraction of the cost. Without the giant clusters his whole theory was built on. And that's the real lesson. The machines were predictable, because machines come down to engineering and money. If you know how big the computers have to be, you can work out the steel and the power they'll need. But people are not predictable. What a government decides to do, how a rival chooses to fight, none of it follows a formula. And here's the part worth sitting with. The half he got right, the steel, the power, the build-out, is the exact half he bet his fortune on. It's made him richer. The half he got wrong, the governments, the rivals, he never put $1 behind. Being right has paid him a fortune. Being wrong hasn't cost him a thing. Then came the last week of July. His fund had been the hottest ticket on Wall Street, up 439% in the first half of the year, $20 billion at its peak. one of the fastest runs any new fund had ever posted. Then, on July 27th, a note landed. Citadel Securities, Ken Griffin's trading firm, predicted a surprise rate hike from the Fed against what the entire market expected. Stocks were already sliding. The note deepened the fall. The AI names his fund was long collapsed. The semiconductor index down almost 30% from its June peak, and his portfolio was leveraged 4-to-1. Every dollar of losses hit 4 times harder. The margin calls came in. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America, and he had no choice. He was forced to sell everything, the entire portfolio, at the bottom. And the buyer of those exact same stocks? Ken Griffin's hedge fund, Citadel. The firm whose note had deepened the crash bought the shares it forced out, at the discount. Citadel says the two things have nothing to do with each other. 20 billion became 10. The build-out he predicted is still coming. The steel, the gigawatts, all of it, still on schedule. It just no longer belongs to him. In the end, it wasn't the machines that broke him. It was people, a rival's note, a nervous Fed, a margin call. The half he never learned to predict. Just took the half he did. So maybe the real question isn't whether Leopold was right. It's how much of the future is already locked in by engineering and money, and how much still depends on choices we haven't made yet.